Hi, my name is Taylor, and I'm joined today with my partners, Destry, Cody, Casey, and Joey. And we're going to be talking today about the feasibility of locating a pilot plant facility for a bio-based alternative on Port Townsend's site. Before we do that, I want to get into first who we are and why we're here. Washington State University is in collaboration with NARA, the Northwest Advanced Renewable Alliance. This collaboration of individuals is government, industry, and university partners, all working under a grant given by the United States this grant is funded. It's a $40 million grant funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, understanding the feasibility of locating biomass from forest management and ultimately creating it into biojet fuel. Before we get into that, I wanted to talk about the main goals of NARA and how that plays into our process. Sustainability is a key component into our process and how we understand creating jet fuel from a woody biomass. Not just creating biomass or jet fuel, but also creating valuable co-product. There are other valuable co-products that are created from this process. We also look into the supply chain and how important that can be with a local region and understanding the different steps that go into this process. And finally, a key component of this is understanding what exactly goes into bioenergy and bio-based alternatives. So I'll give you a brief overview of our process. Slash is biomass that is left over from forest maintenance and is typically wasted or burned. What happens is we collect the slash, chip it on site, and then distribute it to a facility called the liquids depot. In the liquids depot, we break down the slash or the chips, and through a process called enzymatic hydrolysis, create a sugar slurry and other valuable co-products. Ultimately, this sugar slurry is then distributed to a biochemical facility where it is then created into isobutanol and later jet fuel. Ultimately, the main goal of NARA and this project is to take this jet fuel and to supplement the aviation industry for their use and their use of oil. An important part of this is locating a pilot plant finding a location for our pilot plant. We feel that Port Townsend paper would be an excellent potential location for this process. The reason why we feel Port Townsend paper would be a strong partner for our process is because of the existing relationship between the Herman brothers and Washington State University and Port Townsend paper. A key component of this is taking the slash from the landing site and the logging site and distributing it to the liquids depot. Herman Brothers has an existing trucking facility that is already working in this region and already distributing the biomass to Port Townsend paper. We would simply be getting them to draw more biomass from the region and adding to their chip pile, which we would use from. Port Townsend paper also has ample space, as you can see here, on their parcel, where we feel that we could find a strong location for our pilot plant. Port Townsend, in general, outside of Port Townsend paper, Port Townsend embodies the same ideals and goals that we talked about earlier with sustainability. Sustainability, as I said earlier, is a key component to our process, and we feel that Port Townsend paper would appreciate that about us. In this presentation, we're going to be talking today about the liquids depot, some brief demands, and how this overall affects Port Townsend. Then we're going to zoom out and look at the biomass availability in the region and understand what we would draw from and what Port Townsend paper uses, and analyze the feasibility. Then we're going to look at our sugar slurry and lignin and analyze and look at the different co-products outside of not just jet fuel, but what other markets could we tap into. And then we're going to go back to Port Townsend and look at potential sites and how this our pilot plant could potentially fit into theirs. So next I'm going to pass off to Destry, and she's going to talk to you about the Liquids Depot.
Thanks, Taylor. So as you can see, this part of our feasibility analysis takes place on Port Townsend's existing site. Later on, Cody will talk about potential locations for our pilot plant, but for now, let's just dive into what actually goes on in a liquids depot. Here is a flow chart of all of the processes that the woody biomass goes through in the liquids depot in order to be made into residual solids and sugar slurry. As you can see, it's a rather intensive process. More extensive information and details about these processes individually can be found on the NARA cumulative report, or I would be happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability after the presentation. But today, we're just going to discuss the liquids depot in terms of its most basic components. The two main steps in a liquids depot are mild bisulfite pretreatment and enzymatic hydrolysis. Once the woody biomass enters the pretreatment, steam and calcium bisulfite are added into the mix. Any heat created from this process is then recycled back into the system as an energy source. Once the biomass leaves the pretreatment as a pretreatment liquor, it goes through an enzymatic hydrolysis where water, lime, enzymes, and heat are added. At the end of this process, we're left with residual solids and a fermentable sugar slurry. Of course, there are other components necessary to make this pilot plant work. First of all, our team estimates that there would be a daily water demand of about 2 million gallons per day. And that's a number we believe fits into Port Townsend's current available wastewater treatment capacity. Next, our team estimates that this pilot plant will create about 60 new jobs in order to run the plant. And in today's current economy, more locally available work is never a bad thing. Lastly, this plant is projected to take up about 3.5 acres of land. And once again, Cody will later on talk about current available sites at Port Townsend for this pilot plant. That, in a very basic nutshell, are the processes and demands of NARAD's Liquids Depot pilot plant. And now here's Casey to talk about biomass availability in the region.
Hi, I'll be discussing the input into the liquids depot, which is woody biomass. Now when I say biomass, I'm just referring to the post-harvest residuals, or slash. So if a liquids depot is going to be feasible, we need to show that there's enough biomass in the region to supply both the existing hog fuel boiler on site and our liquids depot. We believe the existing hog fuel boiler uses about 120,000 bone-dry tons, or BDT, per year. And for the liquids depot, it needs to use a minimum of about 100,000 bone-dry tons per year. Hopefully more, but right now our minimum target for available biomass in the region is 220,000 bone-dry tons per year. So here's a map of the biomass that could potentially be transported to the mill. We see by the distribution that the far northeast location on the Olympic Peninsula does pose some problems. To the southwest is the Olympic National Park, and we can't draw biomass out of there. There's also a lot of water surrounding the mill. Some biomass is brought in via barge, but the majority is trucked in, so we only considered areas in our analysis where we would truck biomass in. So we used a cost-based method when determining quantities available, and this is beneficial because we can see how volumes change based on the cost of the material. And the total cost is based on some assumptions. They're listed here. These are the fixed cost assumptions, and to make the total cost, we add the transportation cost. It's also useful because if you know the total amount of biomass you need, you can see the cost based on the supply curve. So we chose 3 different costs per bone-dry ton to show how the volumes vary with this method. Starting at $63 per bone-dry ton, we can see that 81,000 bone-dry tons are available per year. And this is the cost to get the material that's farthest away, so it's up to $63 per bone-dry ton. And if we move up to $68, we see that 146,000 bone dry tons are available per year. And finally, if we go to $73, we see that there's about 246,000 BDTs available per year. And we stopped here because it's most likely not feasible to go any farther out, since we can see that material east of Tacoma and Seattle shows up, and it's highly unlikely that the mill would travel that far to bring material in. So the actual quantity would be slightly lower than this if we subtract some of those areas, but it appears that our minimum goal of 220,000 bone dry tons per year is met, if not it's at least close, which is very encouraging for us, because our data, we believe it's vastly underestimating the actual quantity that exists, because based on some studies from the University of Washington and the state of Washington, we see that our data is vastly underestimating the quantity per acre of slash left after a forest harvest operation. It's also important to note that only about 14% of the easily accessible biomass on the Olympic Peninsula is marketed currently, and this came from another study from the University of Washington. And this is significant because if the mill is able to already supply the hog fuel boiler with biomass, there should be plenty for the liquids depot, since such a little percentage on the Olympic Peninsula is currently being utilized. So our next steps would be to explore additional methods which we believe to be more accurate and come up with new numbers. And we believe that they'll be significantly higher than our quantities right now. And this would show that the liquids depot wouldn't be competing with a hog fuel boiler for feedstock, but rather could complement the mill. And now to discuss the potential benefits of the liquids depot at the site and benefits for the community, here's Joey.
Thank you, Casey. So now that we got to look at how the liquids depot works and how much we have available in biomass around the area and the region, I'm going to be looking at two of our major outputs, a sugar slurry and lignin, and kind of where you can go with those two outputs and products. So first we're going to start off with the sugar slurry, because that is a major output from our pilot plant. Again, I just want to say that our sugar slurry is made from the forest residuals after a logging operation. They aren't the lumber, and from our projections of our pilot plant, we see that we can create about 4 bone dry tons of glucose from about 100 bone dry tons of input. This opens up the doors for a few different markets. A few we wanted to point out were the isobutanol producers, livestock feed, and other alcohol markets. So we obviously see isobutanol being our number one. It aligns with NAR's goal to create a sustainable, greener aviation jet fuel, as well as, there's big regional markets with SeaTac and PDX, and it doesn't look like the aviation industry is going to go anywhere anytime soon. Another one is our livestock feed. Currently there's a wood molasses that's being used as an additive to livestock feed, and you can take our sugar slurry and actually use that as a substitute for that, and with cattle ranches in Washington State and the 4-state region, we see it as being a nice spot for Port Townsend to actually export their sugar slurry to those markets around the region. And lastly, with the other alcohol markets, there are other big companies that use other enzymes to create different alcohols besides isobutanol, and they create bio-based alternatives. One I wanted to point out was butanidol. It's projected that that it will reach a $9 billion cap by 2019, and it's pretty interesting because that kind of material can be used in things such as plastics and sportswear and clothing, and so we see that as being a pretty cool market. And we couldn't find a good local regional market, but we believe that you could keep it domestic within the United States and find buyers. So now that we looked at the sugar market, I kind of wanted to look at now the other product, which is lignin. Lignin is definitely another co-product from our pilot plant, and yearly there is a worldwide production of 50 million tons a year. 2% of that is actually converted into products, leaving the rest used in boilers as a hog fuel to provide energy for the mills and plants themselves. Our projections on our pilot plant is the fact that if you put in 100 bone dry tons of biomass, we can output about 40 bone dry tons of lignin. That's a lot of potential for other products, and a few we want to point out were resins and sealants, bioplastics, and activated carbons. reasons why I wanted to point out resins and sealants is that we all know that plywood uses a formaldehyde containing resin, and in the Northwest we have a couple manufacturers. For example, Hardell Mutual and Chehalis, they make plywood, and if Port Townsend was to make their lignin and give it over to Hardell Mutual over in Chehalis and create a lignin-based resin and create a greener, safer plywood, it'd be a pretty cool thing to do in the Northwest region. As well as, another thing we just want to quickly mention is up in West Fraser across the border there is research and work being done in other renewable biocarbon products. So there's regional areas close by that Port Townsend would be able to export to. And so now that we kind of looked at those kind of bigger pictures, I kind of want to hone in towards the community. Again, I just want to say that we estimate that 60 jobs could be created. The mill has an average salary of about $70,000, which is above the average county rate, and the city of Port Townsend actually accounts for half of the workers at the mill. And so this leaves a lot of potential with the high salary and the new jobs to actually bring in a tax revenue to that community. And so we find that pretty interesting and wanted to bring that up. And so now I'm gonna turn it over to Cody to talk about the existing site details.
Thanks, Joey. Let's take a look at Port Townsend Paper Company's site. As you can see in the graphic, the site is represented by the kraft process and the pulp production. So this is Port Townsend Paper Company's property. The city of Port Townsend is just to the north, and Glen Cove, which is the Puget Sound, is just to the east. The total size between these two lots is about 450 acres. So the red here shows the existing infrastructure of the current mill operations. The wastewater treatment pond is included in here, and this area is about 110 acres. This includes the existing infrastructure such as the wastewater treatment pond and all of the buildings and structures required for the daily production of paper products. One thing to note when looking at placing a pilot plant on Port Townsend Paper Company's property is that the north lot is zoned as heavy industrial and the south lot is zoned as residential. The reason that this is important is because the pilot plant will need to be placed on heavy industrial land. So if it was going to be placed in the south lot, that land would need to be converted to heavy industrial zone land, which is a process that goes through the county, and that could be difficult because of the scrutiny that the mill is already under. So the pilot plant in the graphic is represented by the liquid depot and the lignin recovery. We looked at 3 possible sites on the property that we analyzed for suitability for placing a pilot plant. We wanted to look at every area that was even possible to place a plant on because of the limited amount of room on their property. So the first site that we looked at is the southern clearing in the southern lot. This site is attractive because it is well graded and is already a large site and is out of the way of the current mill operations. The reason that this is good is because it would put the pilot plant out of view of the public, but it could be a detriment because it's far away from the existing infrastructure of the mill, such as electricity and water, wastewater. But the biggest downside to this is that it is in that residential zone area. So again, we'd have to switch the land from residential zone to heavy industrial zone. Let's take a look at another site. The northern property is about 75 acres between Mill Road and the northern property boundary. This land is attractive because there's plenty of space and it is zoned heavy industrial. However, it is potentially too steep as there's about a 150-foot difference from Mill Road to that boundary. So we'd probably have to grade and level a spot for the pilot plant. Also, the Pacific Northwest Larry Scott Trail runs through this site, which may not necessarily be an issue, but it would be a complication with choosing. Also, this is in the zone between the mill and the city, so it would be getting rid of that buffer zone between the two, which is a desired aspect currently. So the third site that we looked at, and the one that we like the most, is the yard in between the chip pile and the wastewater treatment pond. This is a large plot, about 12 acres, and it is in the heavy industrial zone area, and it could easily be developed as it is already flat. The only real weakness to this area is that it is not completely unused. It may not be completely unused by the mill currently, or they may have plans for it in the future. But we still feel that this area is ideal for suiting the pilot plant. So now that we've looked at some of the places that we could put the mill, Taylor is going to summarize everything that we've looked at and look forward to what NARA is doing.
Thank you, Cody. So in summary, today we talked to you today a little about the liquids depot and what goes into our process. Then we zoomed out and looked at the region and the biomass availability. Understood that yes, there is some available, but there is a lot that we still need to understand about this region. Finally, we went and looked at the markets for such, outside of the potential for biojet fuel, and then zoomed into Port Townsend and potential site locations, weighing the pros and cons. Real quick, I just wanted to recap on Port Townsend and why we're choosing Port Townsend and why we think it's a suitable place for a pilot plant. Again, like I said before, we feel Port Townsend in general really embodies the sustainability and the same ideals and goals that NARA does, in the sense of if there were to be somebody that could create green energy, we feel that Port Townsend would definitely be the place for it, and that they would support a process like this. Also, as Cody mentioned, there is ample space at Port Townsend. Depending on where we look, there is one specific place that we feel our pilot plant would really fit nicely in with the existing facility at Port Townsend Paper Company. And finally, looking specifically at Port Townsend Paper Company, we feel that this bio-based alternative process will be an excellent addition to their portfolio and accompanying to making pulp and paper. This industry is increasingly growing, and many companies are investing millions of dollars into the research into this and getting away from fossil fuels and towards green energy. And I believe that Port Townsend Paper would definitely be interested in this opportunity. So, in looking further in what's next for us as we continue our study, we actually need your help and your support, both from Port Townsend and for Port Townsend Paper Company. For things like understanding the existing facility and infrastructure at Port Townsend, things like site files and how we could better integrate our pilot plant facility onto theirs. Information like we would have emissions, same as Port Townsend Paper, and how would our stormwater or emissions mix into their treatment facility, where there's room for that, and how we could make that work. And as far as a plant siting, we have a #1 choice, but is this choice a viable option? And thoughts from Port Townsend Paper themselves. So we hope that you learned a lot about this process, the supply chain that goes into taking a biomass and creating a green energy. And we hope that you continue and look more into it on NARA's website. And we hope that we've gained your support in this. We've actually got some questions from some viewers, and I'm going to pass it off to one of my partners, and they're going to answer some questions that we've received. Thank you.
So we received a question about whether we've considered harvesting biomass from line development, and we really haven't because it's so small in proportion compared to what we get from a logging site. And also, we're mainly concerned with logging sites because they're renewable, and we can predict with models how much is available every life cycle for a tree, which is about 30 years. So I think I'm going to hand it off to Destry, who will answer the second question.
Hello again. We received a question about whether we had considered a microionized wood mill instead of a mild bisulfite pretreatment process. That's a great question. Actually, another half of our team is looking into that process on a different site. But at Port Townsend, they're already using equipment that could handle the mild bisulfite treatment, and therefore their wastewater treatment facility could handle that runoff. There was also question and slight concern over the amount of water needed for this pilot plant. The demand for the pilot plant we're talking about with the mild bisulfite pretreatment is again about 2 million gallons per day. And it sounds like a lot of water, but all of that is actually going to be recycled back into the system at least a 95% efficiency. So it's not necessarily drawing 2 million gallons every single day. Lastly, there were concerns about Port Townsend community and their not liking the smell that sulfur puts off from the mild bisulfite pretreatment. And we have factored in equipment costs for air scrubbers and other possibilities into our calculations. So at this point, if there are no more questions, I think we're going to wrap it up. If you think of anything else that you would like to know, just send us an email and we'll answer as quickly as possible. But with that, thank you for joining us.